Okay, so this video in the Joe Knowledge series is going to be on the cycles of function for the M4 carbine. This also applies to the M16 and any civilian AR-15 models. I'm doing this from home, and I currently don't have a Class 3 license, so we won't be doing it with an actual M4. We'll be doing it with one of my personal weapons. The operating system is identical in both situations. I just don't have the full auto capability. The cycle of function doesn't change. Once I go through everything else, I'll explain what the only difference would be if we had full auto or a 3-round burst capability. So we're doing everything safely. We have dummy rounds, weapon is clear, and let's begin on the cycles of function. Going through them, you have feeding, chambering, locking, firing, unlocking, extracting, ejecting, and cocking. So let's get into what each one of those are. Okay, so the first cycle of function is feeding. And I've taken the upper receiver off of this weapon to give you a better visual representation of what's happening. What's actually happening is the bolt carrier is taking that round and it is stripping it from the magazine, and then it is pushing it forward into the feed ramps. The feed ramps that are in the upper receiver, probably won't be able to get this to focus at all. There are these two cutouts. You can kind of see them right there. Maybe I'll get a light on them a little bit later. There are these two cutouts right there that actually angle the round up and into the chamber. Might have been able to do that a little better if I took the buffer out. Let's see. So the bolt carrier group would be back here at about this position. And as you see, the teeth on the bolt face, we're going to engage that round and push it forward. So as it does that, see how it begins to remove it from the magazine? The feed lips would be right in front of that, and that round would then strip it forward out of the magazine like that and into the feed ramp. That was a little ugly, but you get the idea. All right, so the next thing that we're going to be talking about is chambering. And I do have a flashlight this time, so we'll be able to see those feed ramps as well. So if we look in here, you have your chamber. That's a little bit much for this. All right. So looking in there, you can see your chamber right behind the star chamber. Okay, so that hole that's somewhat in the shape of your casing, and right there are your feed ramps. So this round then travels up those feed ramps. I'm exaggerating it in there so you can see. Then aligns into that chamber and goes all the way in. So you see how it's fully seated in there now. The bolt face would then be against that. It would be grabbing onto the round with the extractor, and it would begin to then go into the next phase of the cycles of function, which is locking. So as you can see right there, there's some space. See how the teeth that are in there are a negative of what your bolt face is. So those teeth would pass through there. And once we begin locking, what happens then? So this round is now fully seated on your bolt face. Okay. And see how the bolt face rotates? Once it's pushed completely into the chamber and these teeth pass that front of the star chamber, okay, they would then hit the back of the actual chamber where the bolt is. And when it pushes in, they rotate. They only rotate the length of one of those teeth. And what that's doing is now those teeth are in line with each other on the back side, and this is locked. So any pressure from this side, from the round going off, any pressure right here is not going to be transferred to this bolt carrier group, because the bolt face is going to take all of that pressure against the back of the star chamber. Okay. So the next cycle of function then is going to be firing. All right. We're going to probably have to, maybe do this in some pieces here. But so at this point, it's locked. The bolt's completely forward. There's a live round in the chamber. You've flipped your selector from safe to fire, and you've pulled the trigger. Okay, so when you pull that trigger, see how the hammer comes up right there, what it's doing is, see how your firing pin is protruding right here through the back of the bolt carrier group? Okay, that hammer, the bolt inside of the weapon would be right there. Okay, you see where that alignment's happening? You see how even me just setting it there has pushed that firing pin into, you know, the bolt face here? So that's exactly what you're seeing happen, is when you pull that trigger, okay, this is completely lined up here, and when you pull that trigger, the hammer passes through that space in the bolt, striking the back of the firing pin. Okay, that firing pin is then hitting the primer, and the primer is setting the round off inside of the weapon. And that's pretty much firing. I guess you can get a good feel for it. You don't really need it on the weapon, but having the bolt carrier right here, I think, really demonstrates that a little bit better. Seeing where that hammer is actually traveling and how it's happening. Okay, so now we moved on to unlocking. And what you have to understand with unlocking, okay, the round's in here, and you know the round would be about right here. The round's fired, the round begins to travel down the barrel. Okay, at some point there is what is called your gas block. Okay, and this is in your gas system. You know, they say an M4 is a gas operated system. So once that bullet passes where your gas block is, okay, now some of the gas, some of that charge travels up the gas block through the gas tube and comes back to the bolt carrier group. Okay, so when this is locked and this bolt is closed inside of the weapon, that gas tube is ending inside of this gas key, this gas port right here. The tube is inside of there. So if you were to take this gas key off, and don't, because you really shouldn't, it should be staked and really hard to take off. If you were to take it off though, there's a hole in the bottom of this key that goes into this big open space, okay, behind the bolt face. And those rings that are on your bolt face are past these little holes here right now with the bolt pushed forward. Okay, so what it creates is like basically like the cylinder in a car. All right, so it fills up with gas, it creates a bunch of pressure, and it pushes this almost like a piston away. When it pushes this, it's actually pushing the bolt carrier group away, because this again is locked against the inside of your star chamber. When it pushes this away, that's what rotates this back to unlock it, and that force drives the bolt back to the rear. Extra gas, if you watch like super high speed footage of it, some of that extra gas is then blown out of these two ports right here once the rings pass them the other way, so that you don't just have an overcharged, essentially, bomb here. Okay, there's some place for that gas to go. The gas then drives the bolt back and starts what our next cycle is, which is extracting. So the next cycle of function then is extracting. And if we look here at this bolt face, okay, it's kind of hard for me to see and do this, but this little guy right here is your extractor. All right, this is your ejector, and we'll get to that. See how that's a little plunger sticking out there? And here's your extractor. This is like a hook, right? And it's going to hook onto the lip of the round here, your head stamp there. And if you look, we can hook it in here, and there's a bunch of force against that ejector, right? But you see how it's holding it, and if I pull straight, I can't pull it out of here, right? So that is the extractor. That's going to be what is pulling that round out of the chamber after it is fired and the gas begins to drive the bolt back. So because we're already here and we already have that good visual of that bolt face right there, you see how this little plunger, I can push it in. That should always move freely, okay? Because what's happening here is your round is set in the bolt face like that, and that plunger is causing a great deal of pressure against the one side of the chamber. All right, and as that round begins to move out, once it clears, that ejector then is going to flip just like that, the round out of your ejection port in the upper receiver. So let's see if we can get this to grab. Let's see if I can show you what it would look like there. All right, pretty sure it grabbed. So, nope, it didn't. Get enough that time? No, it's not gonna grab this. Okay. Okay, so just for the sake of this, I did have to use a real round that I've placed in here. But there's no lower attached to this. I have no safety concerns right now. But I'll be able to show you that as this bolt begins to move to the rear, okay, you see that round is actually being pressured outward already by that little plunger that's on the back, right? So as it travels backwards, once it's clear of that chamber, it's going to flick it out, and that is ejecting. All right, so the last cycle of function that we have here is cocking. So this happens pretty much simultaneously with ejecting. But what's happening is because we've fired and now that hammer is in that upward position, right? Okay, so the hammer is in the upward position. As this bolt is driven back, you can watch what it does to that hammer. Okay, it tips it down, all right, as the bolt would travel to the rear. You see how it's pushed it down there? And then the bolt would reciprocate back forward because of the buffer, back into its locked position. But if you look, the hammer stays down, right? That's because it was cocked with that operation. The bolt carrier group traveling to the rear drove it down and began to pass over it, which then cocked that hammer for the next round to be fired. All right, so that covers your standard cycles of function. Listing them off in that manner is going to be the correct answer for any time you're questioned about the M4 or the M16. The only difference is once you go into full auto, okay, and again, this isn't included because it doesn't change the cycle of function. All it actually changes is what this trigger does, okay? The system still operates exactly the same. But if you were to be in full auto, once cocking occurs, okay, it's cocked, there's another lever back here, and as the bolt carrier closes, it would trip that lever and essentially act like the trigger, okay, without you ever moving your finger. If it doesn't trip that auto sear, which is what that is, it would, you know, you can see it when you open your M4, you'll see a little flipper back here. When it trips that auto sear, it lets the hammer go again. It's like a trigger just set up here. Does the exact same thing. Does it a little bit differently with the spur on the hammer, but the best way to think about it is it's a bolt activated trigger. If it were a 3-round burst application, there is a little cam that would reside on the side of the hammer here, and that cam has 2 lobes and 1 catch. And so that auto sear would then actuate just like it would in full auto, but once it got to the catch on the 3rd round with the cam on the side of the hammer, that would then activate a sear that would lock the hammer back down. So it would not fire that 4th round. That's really the only difference is when you take that lever 1 more over. Again, that does not change the cycle of function. It just changes the trigger, how the cycle of function is initiated from the point of firing. Everything else remains exactly the same. So again, you have feeding, chambering, locking, firing, unlocking, extracting, ejecting, cocking. So that is the cycles of function broken down and explained. Hope you took good notes.